In 2004, PBS launched a new programming block called PBS Kids Go, intended as a more older-skewing counterpoint to the regular PBS Kids, in that Go was aimed at kids 6 and up, whereas the regular PBS Kids was more aimed at kids 2 to 8. Premiering alongside the new block was a show called Maya and Miguel, which I remember as the one with the girl that had a hair tie that sparkled when she had an idea. In 2006, though, Maya and Miguel would become the vehicle for a series of shorts called The Amazing Colossal Adventures of WordGirl, starring a superhero with the powers of vocabulary. And also Superman stuff, but mostly the vocabulary is what's worth talking about, I think.
Perfect means to massage a duck's feet while wearing rubber shoes!
And the very next year, WordGirl would receive her very own full-length PBS Kids Go series, simply being called WordGirl. WordGirl was created by Dorothea Gillum, who had previously worked on the shows Hey Moni and Time Warp Trio. Her aim was to, quote, make kids television smart and funny, saying that the focus was on great stories, characters, and animation. If all those elements are working, then you can hook a child who may come looking for laughs, but leave a little smarter. In keeping with this, writers are chosen not from veterans of children's programming, but instead from veterans of the likes of The Onion and Family Guy. Similarly, its actors were previously known for Arrested Development, Everyone Loves Raymond, Mad TV, and SpongeBob SquarePants. Okay, the last one doesn't really fit. This philosophy ended up producing a very good show that ended up running for 8 seasons, concluding in 2015. It ended up becoming beloved by the kids who watched it, many of whom have revisited the show out of nostalgia and found it to be just as entertaining, or even more so, in their adulthood. For my part, I was one of those kids that didn't have access to cable for several years. As such, I ended up watching a lot of PBS Kids, and WordGirl was probably my favorite show among them. I was initially brought in by the fact that a superhero series would presumably have a lot more action than other shows on the block, and while that was correct, I ended up sticking around more for the characters and the comedy. All the primary cast members, whether they be protagonist, supporting, or villain, were distinct, and they all had their own humorous charm. That said, looking back, I didn't actually watch as much of the show as I expected. Looking over the episode list, I seem to have fallen off the show, or at least started missing all the premieres, around season 3, and while I've watched a few later episodes after getting back into the show as an adult, a lot of season 4 and beyond is a mystery to me. So to celebrate the show, I decided to watch through all of it and share my thoughts on every individual episode, whether I've seen it before or not. And hey, it doesn't hurt that the show has actually been having a bit of a resurgence online lately. So maybe we can parse some of the fandom's seemingly odd opinions and creations along the way. And when I say all the show, I mean it, because we're not starting off with season 1. No, we're going back to the true beginning of the show. The shorts. The Amazing Colossal Adventures of WordGirl.
Hey son, catch!
One thing I'm going to focus on for the shorts and the first few episodes of season 1 is how well what we see reflects the show going forward. And I think this first short succeeds at being the very first piece of WordGirl media ever. The story is very simple. A giant meteorite is flying towards the city and everyone is flung into a panic until WordGirl arrives to catch it and dispose of it. Given that this is only 2 minutes and, unlike other shorts, it has to stand entirely on its own, it ends up feeling very quick and basic, but that's not really a detriment here because they balance their time pretty well. A lot of series staples are established here. The inclusion of word definitions, the narrator having a personality and being audible to the cast, and several characters' personalities and running gags. WordGirl/Becky is bad at keeping her secret, Violet is a somewhat ditzy artist, Scoops is way into journalism to the point of mild tunnel vision, and Captain Huggyface doesn't really get as much respect as he deserves. Granted, these would all end up executed better later on with more time and space to explore and exaggerate these traits, but again, time crunch. Aside from the absence of supervillains, which I honestly think is one of the series' biggest draws, this is a pretty good elevator pitch to introduce the concept and tone of the series quickly. It honestly feels like a Golden Age superhero debut, a shorter story with a simple threat that mainly establishes broad stroke stuff. Heck, given that the short only explicitly reveals WordGirl and Becky to be the same person at the very end, it honestly reminds me of the very first Batman story.
Becky, did you see that? Becky? Did I see what? WordGirl! Oh no, I was, tying my shoe.
Granted, Batman didn't have the Superman secret identity issue in his debut, but it still counts.
Meet?
Rewatching these shorts now, I think they might actually take place immediately after the first short. That one ended with Becky and Violet going to art class, and the first short of this arc has them at art class. Honestly, not really relevant, but it's a nice detail, and it fits with my thesis on this arc. After Catch as Catch Can, these shorts act as the final pieces to introduce a perfect microcosm of the show. During the aforementioned art class, a bank is being robbed by the show's very first supervillain, the Butcher, who summons meat to attack and has a tendency to get words wrong.
Oh, I get it, because you butcher the English language.
What? No, because of all the meat. What do you mean I butchered the English language?
Oh, sorry.
WordGirl and Captain Huggyface attempt to fight off the Butcher, but at both the bank and a jewelry store later on, they end up beaten. During a visit to one Professor Stephen Boxleitner, however, WordGirl hits upon the solution before heading off to a final battle at the grocery store, just having Huggy eat all of the Butcher's meat. The Butcher has a pretty good debut here, striking a balance between goofy and threatening. One moment he's taking out WordGirl in one shot, and another...
Hey buddy, what's your name?
Al?
Al here is my ally.
I'm your what?
Ally, you're my friend who's gonna help me out. We're gonna battle these two.
And then there's the moments where WordGirl praises the Butcher for getting a word right, or when the Butcher thanks WordGirl for trying to clear up a misunderstanding. The jovial, nothing personal relationship between WordGirl and a lot of her villains is arguably the best part of the series, and the Butcher's portrayal here lends itself well to this trope. He's trying to be a dangerous villain, and he's actually not bad at it, but he also has a lighter, goofier side that he doesn't really try to hide.
Not so fast!
Word girl! So, we meet again for the first time.
Right.
On top of the Butcher though, we also get debuts for even more recurring bits. We see Becky's poor skills at art class, although in this specific case I actually like her work in a semi-ironic avant-garde kind of way. We see Exposition Guy, the man who can never find the police station. Honestly, his first few appearances feel like he was supposed to be one-off and not a running gag, but became the latter because the writers liked him so much. We see Reginald, the jewelry store clerk, and honestly, this first appearance is more over-the-top snooty and arrogant than any other appearance of his I remember.
I am not pompous. I am as wonderful as I think I am.
We see Professor Boxleitner, who I honestly don't think appeared enough in this identity. He's just as maniacal and goofy as he gets to be later on in the series, but he's also genuinely well-meaning, and I don't think we ever get to see WordGirl have a mentor figure like this again. I don't think that counts. And we see the grocery store manager, who was never really much of a highlight from what I recall. His one joke here in particular gets old really quickly, although he is carried a bit by his voice actor, Mike O'Connell.
Well, you get big savings on Snappy Snaps. Now 2 for 1 with the coupon. I'll need you to sell these when you work here.
Having the story be split across 5 shorts allowed the story much more room to breathe, which I think was a necessity for setting out the Butcher's personality, MO, and relationship with WordGirl, especially while showing off everything else I mentioned. It's not like the asteroid in the first short had much of a personality at all, really. Heck, the third short doesn't even have the Butcher in it, it's all about WordGirl and Boxleitner. Admittedly, this did run the risk of parts being shown out of order or being more easily missed. Remember that these were Todd the Maya and Miguel episodes, so it's not like you could easily check which short would be airing, and I can't tell how easily accessible these shorts were online, but when watching through everything in order like I am, it does improve the story quality overall. This formula also helped provide a more distinct charm in how the shorts started to feel like old radio or TV serials, particularly the beginning "When We Last Left" narration.
When we last saw WordGirl, she was about to square off against the Butcher in a big battle royale!
It's just fun, which is exactly what the show was trying to be. Fun enough to slip in some vocabulary lessons without kids getting bored. Speaking of which, giving the Butcher a habit of getting words wrong was a clever way of providing opportunities for definitions. A few later villains would have quirks that served the same purpose, and they did a good job enhancing both the education and the entertainment parts of this edutainment show. There's some pretty good jokes outside of the Butcher too, including the first major example of a fourth wall joke outside of the narrator's shenanigans.
I know you know, but they may not.
Who are...
The audience.
Oh, hi.
Lastly, I like how they handled the ultimate conclusion. Since Huggy's love of eating hadn't been established at this point, it wasn't as obvious as it could have been, but adding a few easily missable moments of Huggy eating the Butcher's meat after he escapes helps to build it up in a more subtle way. This is pretty much the last time they can pull this trait out and make it feel climactic on its own, so I'm glad they put in the effort. Overall, like I said, this arc makes a great intro to the series alongside Catch as Catch Can. Although with that said, their total length comes out to about the same as an actual full episode, so maybe you'd be better off just picking a season 1 episode at that point.
Futile! Futile! Futile!
Remember how I said we didn't get enough of Professor Boxleitner as a good guy? Yeah. We open with Boxleitner performing an experiment with his evil lab mouse that goes awry when said mouse presses the
"Holy cow, don't press this button,"
which is just absurd enough I don't care how stupid this trope is. We're then introduced to Becky's annoying younger brother TJ before seeing that Boxleitner has been turned into Dr. Two Brains and is now obsessed with cheese. WordGirl tries to stop him, but he uses his own book on superheroes to escape. Becky goes back home, but Dr. Two Brains demands all the city's cheese or he'll turn all the buildings into goop. WordGirl confronts Two Brains again, but he again uses his superhero knowledge to subdue her. She's rescued when her family unexpectedly shows up, her parents unwittingly distracting Two Brains while TJ rescues her. Like the last arc, there's a lot of running elements established here, so we'll start with the big one, the villain. While I still think Professor Boxleitner was transformed too early, Two Brains is a highlight of WordGirl's rogues gallery. He's described as WordGirl's biggest enemy a few times later on, and I think that's a title he deserves. He feels like if you took an old school version of the Joker and made him a mad scientist. He's competent, but he also revels in his insanity and villainy. Capturing WordGirl in his lair and nearly turning her into goop makes him come across as more dangerous than the Butcher at least. The most charming thing about him is his goals. Whatever he does, whatever he steals, it's always for the purpose of getting cheese. The specificity and lunacy of this goal helps him feel distinct from other villains, and it's just funny. And his voice acting, provided by Tom Kenny himself, is fantastic.
I want all the cheese in the entire city delivered to City Hall, or I will turn every building into a pile of goop.
That said, this arc does set up a couple aspects that, to my memory at least, are reused extremely rarely later on. Firstly, his knowledge of WordGirl's superhero tactics is put to good, and amusing, use here, but I don't think it's ever utilized or even referenced in the show proper outside of a single episode where the book itself appears, but even then it's more about pathos than how Dr. Two Brains fights. Secondly, one of the shorts shows a Jekyll and Hyde dynamic with Boxleitner and Two Brains, but the show depicts it more like Boxleitner becomes just as cheese-obsessed as Squeaky, and the two are on the same side. I know of 2 episodes later in the series that sort of lean back into the Jekyll and Hyde dynamic, but we still never really get to see Boxleitner actively trying to resist Squeaky's desires again. It's not necessarily a problem that these are downplayed later, but it feels like the writers wanted to do more with them and just forgot most of the time. But aside from Two Brains, we're also introduced to Becky's family. Her brother TJ, her mom Sally, and her dad Tim. TJ is WordGirl's biggest fan and Becky's greatest annoyance, which is pretty funny. Although stretching TJ's fanboying to him having a crush on WordGirl is kinda weird, in a bad way. Though admittedly the show is self-aware of how creepy this is, and WordGirl does react appropriately, so that mitigates it a bit at least. Sally and Tim are also fun characters. They at first seem to be the old sitcom trope of dopey husband, competent wife, but when Sally accompanies Tim to Two Brains' lair and is more concerned with clearing up an ambiguity in the doctor's demands than the fact that she's meeting an evil mad scientist who threatened goop-based terrorism, it becomes clear that competent wife is a relative term here.
Oh, fine, keep the cream cheese.
I told you.
You were right. Well, it's been great getting to know you, but...
Hun, the cottage cheese?
Oh, no.
The show uses both of them well. Tim gets to be a consistent humor highlight, while Sally actually has more genuine involvement in some stories later on thanks to her job as a district attorney. We haven't gotten there yet, but I promise we will. Overall, this was a pretty good arc with a lot of good jokes and an entertaining villain who stands out from the Butcher in a good way. I've already said that the villains are a highlight of WordGirl, and I'd say that's apparent by this point. Oh, yeah, we also get to see Two Brains' henchmen for the first time. They're not much here, they got one decent joke and otherwise just do Two Brains' dirty work. Fine, but we'll see more from them later on.
It's gangster's paradise.
Gotta go fast.
No!
We open with an armored car that's approached by a woman named Granny May, who uses a sweet little old lady act, as well as her enormous grandson Eugene, to rob it. Becky, Violet, and Bob, Puggy's secret identity, end up walking by, and Becky and Bob dash off to intercept the criminals. They catch Granny May at the jewelry store, but she blinds them with her stolen jewelry and traps them in super strong yarn. The two are almost crushed by Eugene, but they're saved when Violet shows up and befriends him, allowing WordGirl to get Granny May's stolen jewelry back. Granny May is probably the least interesting and enjoyable of the original few villains to me, but she's still fun. Her sweet old lady act does get stale after a while, but she does manage to have a decent amount of versatility in her plans over the course of the show. Her quirk of having poor hearing, or maybe she's faking it to sell her act, is another good vector for definitions, though it does get to be one of the less entertaining ones. One thing I like with no reservations is how she's actually able to fight while keeping her theme, with stuff like super strong yarn and, later on, weakening perfume and blinding purse mints. And then she hard pivots into wearing a mechanical suit of armor that allows her to fly. And that is just this show's brand of absurd in a good way. This arc also gives us a bit more focus on Violet. As the show progresses, it seems to lean more into her being ditzy, but that's comparatively downplayed early on, with this arc specifically focusing on her kindness and soft-spoken nature in befriending Eugene. Violet never really gets complex, at least until the very end, but she serves her role as a fun supporting character and good friend to Becky pretty well. But as for this arc itself, one thing that's notable is how it's focused on a single face-off with Granny May. The Butcher and Two Brains arcs both had multiple encounters with the villain, and they both had some time to regroup. This change is presumably because we're down from arcs being 5 shorts long to being 3 shorts long, and this format persists for the rest of the 2-minute shorts. This has its pros and cons. On the one hand, the new format helps the stories feel more focused and quick, but the old format gave the story more time to breathe and allowed more time to flesh out side elements. I don't think the Two Brains arc would have worked as well if the Butcher arc hadn't introduced Professor Boxleitner, or if Becky's family hadn't gotten decent screen time before their appearance in Squeaky's Machine. I guess it's just a matter of designing your story around the format you're given, which all these arcs do well enough when you get down to it. The biggest flaw of this arc, I think, is the humor. It doesn't really have as many good jokes as previous shorts, and I already mentioned how the main running gag, Granny May's poor hearing, isn't as funny as the show would like. That said, it's not completely devoid of good humor. I particularly like the moment where the narrator flat out tells WordGirl where Granny May is.
Where is he?
A jewelry store.
Thanks.
Don't mention it.
It works as a fourth wall joke, and I think it might also be a meta sort of thing. They're lampshading how they need to keep the pace up, and thus they need to move things along artificially. The last minor issue I have is Granny May's defeat. Violet removing Eugene from the picture is fine, but then Granny dons her armor to escape, WordGirl takes the purse full of jewelry, and Granny flies away like she's suddenly lost control? I have to assume this is another time thing. This ending feels very rushed, but there's not really anything in the final short you could cut, aside from maybe replacing the looking at clouds ending with WordGirl looking out the window to see Violet and Eugene looking happy or something. In the end, this is probably the worst of the short arcs, but it's not bad. If you really want to watch the shorts, there's no real reason to skip this one.
PBS.
Hey look, it's me before age 10. We open on a giant robot attacking the city before WordGirl takes it down in 5 seconds. If only all our foes could be defeated this easily. After learning the robot was built by a Tobey and finding his lost remote, she returns home to find her mom has organized a playdate with a boy named Theodore McAllister III. When he sees Becky has the remote, he reveals that he's Tobey and deduces that Becky is WordGirl. Becky denies it, but Tobey summons a robot to smash her house. Desperate to prevent her secret identity from being discovered, Becky has Bob pretend to be WordGirl for just long enough to distract Tobey and let her destroy the robot herself. Tobey is promptly taken away by his mother. Tobey, to me, is like Avatar: The Last Airbender or Pokemon Black and White. Very good, but also kind of overrated. His basic shtick can be described as Jimmy Neutron if he was evil and 99% of his inventions were just giant robots. And it's fun to see his ego get dashed every episode. I especially like the recurring bit of him losing his British accent when stammering at his mother about to punish him.
Oh dear. No, Mom, I can explain. It's all her fault.
And then there's his other recurring joke. Him being in love with WordGirl, with the implication that his villainy is at least partially an effort to get her attention. This has led Becky to become the most popular ship, and maybe even the most popular thing in the WordGirl fandom. Seriously, this is freaking rampant. And honestly, I'm not entirely on board with how popular this is. Not really from a moral standpoint. Most shippers, from what I've seen, are at least self-aware enough to have Tobey stop destroying buildings before the two get together. But I just think having WordGirl reciprocate those feelings misses the point. A villain being in love with a hero and the hero being completely unable to stand this is very funny. Despite Tobey mainly running on shtick and humor though, he actually manages to make this arc legitimately tense with the first time Becky's secret identity is ever put at risk of being revealed.
You know, that's just the kind of thing that WordGirl would say.
Well, I am not WordGirl. That's, filthy.
It feels more personal and psychological than just threatening to destroy WordGirl, and it's something that inherently can't be solved through brute strength alone. There are a lot of episodes where WordGirl has to use cunning to fight a villain, but this is something that necessitates cunning. Oh, and a small bit I like? I'm not sure why, but something about sunset scenes in the show managed to be particularly tense, and this is the first place where the show utilizes that. That said, this doesn't mean we need to take the situation entirely seriously. Her plan involves having Bob the Monkey dress up as her, after all. Ultimately, this was a good introduction to a villain who has proven himself to be a romp to watch, even if I think the fandom tends to play him up a bit too much. Seriously, Tobey is rivaled only by Dr. Two Brains in fanart, and he's a more popular Becky ship than her actual pseudo-love interest and her best friend who I'm half convinced already has a crush on her.
Same here, WordGirl. Same here. Arrivederci.
And hey, speaking of that pseudo-love interest I mentioned...
Mass destruction.
Oh, yeah!
These shorts reintroduce us to Scoops, Becky's aspiring reporter friend who we very quickly learn Becky has a crush on. The two happen upon a guy named Chuck, who has a sandwich for a head, tying up the grocery store manager after he criticized Chuck's overly powerful sandwich press. Becky attempts to fight Chuck as WordGirl, but he ends up subduing her and tying her up on the sandwich press alongside Scoops. WordGirl is able to summon Captain Huggyface to arrive, however, and he destroys the press with a crowbar.
Not just any crowbar, the ultimate crowbar.
I think I just heard Gordon Freeman's jaw drop. Anyway, here we have our final of the original 5 villains, good old Chuck. What you see is what you get. A guy who likes sandwiches, but is also a supervillain, but is also kind of friendly, awkward, and not the most competent, but is also capable of building impressive sandwich-themed machines. He's yet another villain with a definition quirk, specifically that he often fails to remember the proper word for something. It gets a bit repetitive over time, but I like how his refrain of, "oh, what's the word?" helps build up his awkward nature. I do actually have some insight on Chuck that I think is pretty interesting, but we're going to save that for Season 1 because his first episode there really encapsulates what I want to talk about. Aside from that, there's not really much new to say about Chuck, but he does a good job at being the most friendly of the original villains in a show where, as I mentioned, some of the best moments come from WordGirl and the villains being friendly. We also get to see a bit more of Scoops in this arc, though like Chuck, there's less to discuss with him than previous supporting characters. Granted, the first short already set up his being a reporter thing, so all that's left is his basic personality. Friendly, determined, and inquisitive. And the fact that Becky has a crush on him. Even then though, we really only see Scoops' friendliness here, and Becky's crush just amounts to some stammering and blushing, barely even a joke. So there's not as much to talk about with regards to recurring elements, but that's not all there is to these shorts. Standing on their own, they're actually really good. This being Chuck's introduction lends itself to some good jokes about him not being 100% sure about his branding.
Nobody will laugh at the name Chuck, the evil sandwich-making guy, ever again. Okay, what do you think of Destructo the Destroyer?
While I complained about the grocery store manager previously, he's actually a lot better here. He gets to partake in different jokes both alongside the other characters and on his own. I actually think the trick is that Chuck was legitimately looking for a job of sorts there, so his indignation felt more natural and he wasn't hiring and firing Chuck over and over. One joke I wasn't a big fan of though was Captain Huggyface being left behind by WordGirl. This was actually already used in the Two Brains arc, but at least there it had a funny bit to it.
Hi, I'm Captain Huggyface, superhero. Would you give me a ride to the nearest bus stop? Well, sure.
Here it's just, WordGirl forgets Huggy at the grocery store and he needs to take the bus home. The idea of a superhero taking public transportation is amusing, but I just end up feeling sorry for Huggy being left behind by his friend. Especially here, since he's the thing that saved WordGirl. So yeah, while this arc ends on a bit of a sour note, it's on the whole pretty good and funny, with the star once again being the newly introduced villain, but everyone involved gets a chance to shine.
And dead. Time for the lightning round.
All the rest of the shorts are only a minute long, and none of them are grouped into a longer story, so there's not nearly as much to discuss with these ones. As such, we'll just be going over them in a lightning round format. WordGirl, WordGirl, WordGirl. Styled after a movie trailer, discusses WordGirl's origin for the first time. Has good jokes and the narrator criticizing Huggy's ability to fly a spaceship and the booming voice getting stuck on loop at the end. WordGirl and the Butcher. The Butcher wants to beefify the city with a special bomb, but he's defeated by birds. Him learning what a vegetarian is for the first time is funny, and I love the easy way or the hard way joke.
Well, I guess the easy way.
Could you turn the switch off? You're closer.
Yeah, okay.
WordGirl and Dr. Two Brains. Dr. Two Brains tries to crush WordGirl with a giant weight, but it doesn't work until he's the one under it. It's a pretty standard joke. That description I gave is also a perfect fit for the credit sequence of Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, but it's lent new life by Two Brains and WordGirl's frustration.
Listen, I know you're frustrated, and I'd really like to wait around, but I kinda have to get going.
No, it's fine, I understand.
WordGirl and Chuck the evil sandwich making guy. Chuck wraps WordGirl and Huggy in hot dogs, but Huggy starts eating them. The only two jokes here are Huggy likes to eat and people mistake Huggy for another animal, both jokes done better before and after this. The most noteworthy thing about this short is the sandwich villain wielding hot dogs, single-handedly putting the debate over whether they're sandwiches to rest. WordGirl and Dr. Two Brains Part 2. WordGirl arrives to stop Two Brains' latest plan, but the two end up sharing mixed fruit beverages until Huggy ambushes Two Brains. Another good WordGirl and a villain being casual joke, with the timing in particular on WordGirl's mind changing and Huggy's attack being great.
I said forget! Which kind do you have?
Becky and Scoops. Scoops is thinking over WordGirl's secret identity while Becky saves him from random street dangers. Ironically, this sets up Scoops in the show better than the Chuck shorts by detailing a major motivation of his, but it's also entertaining on its own, both from Scoops' oblivious speculation and Becky's adorable reaction to Scoops saying WordGirl is cute.
Me
she's from France and got her powers when she ate nuclear cheese.
He thinks I'm cute.
WordGirl and the narrator. WordGirl argues with the narrator over a new intro she wants him to try out. Despite the potential of the WordGirl-narrator relationship, this short isn't all that funny and doesn't really play up the narrator's status as a fourth wall entity as well as it could have. This is not helped by the first half just being rather plain, uninteresting arguing. WordGirl and Captain Huggy Face Part 1. WordGirl has Huggy try on 2 new costumes he doesn't like. Similar to the previous short, the jokes aren't all that funny, though maybe it'd feel different if I hadn't known what the new costumes would look like for years. The lack of music to emphasize Huggy and WordGirl's reactions doesn't help. Also, this isn't all that relevant, but the depiction of the robots is very early installment weirdness. Who's firing those lasers, the military? WordGirl and Captain Huggy Face Part 2. Huggy shows up late to a giant robot fight, causing him and WordGirl to discuss transportation. It's basically just the previous short, but with a better joke and better timing, and also music. That said, it'd work better if we hadn't already seen them use the obvious solution of WordGirl carrying Huggy in previous shorts. Also, they very blatantly reuse a shot from the Tobey Arc despite that being at a very different time of day, which I can't help but chuckle at. Who is WordGirl? Becky is relaxing at home with her dad when an investigative report on WordGirl's secret identity comes up. The report describing exactly what Becky's doing at the moment is a bit, yes, that's the joke, we get it, but the shots gradually showing off more and more pictures of Becky in the exact same pose as WordGirl's photo is pretty funny.
In a city gone plum loco.
In a city gone plum loco.
So that's about it. The effective prologue of WordGirl. It wasn't perfect, and there's a couple places where you can tell the crew was finding its footing, but they're not as egregious as I expected. Heck, making these shorts probably helped the crew get a feel for the characters and world before production on the show proper. I wouldn't say these are strictly necessary. Honestly, WordGirl is a very episodic show, so episodes that are required to understand plot points are few and far between, but if you're really into the show, I'd say give them a watch. Just don't expect to find anything better than TV broadcast reps. Next time on...
A coupon that gives me eternal control of the city!
May I have my kite back, please? No.
What is that?
Stuff.
What kind of stuff?
Things. I can feel the power! The supreme power of meat!
Guess I've been ditched.